Hi there. Thanks so much to everyone who has joined us. My name is Chris Wiebe, and I'm with the Bridges Education Group, the umbrella organization for Bridges Academy, Bridges Grad School, and TUI News. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second episode of Critical Conversations about Cognitive Diversity, hosted by Scott Barry Kaufman. Today, our focus is dyslexia, and I'd like to thank you all for the questions you submitted to help us plan for the episode today. Our guests are Dr. Fumiko Hoeft and Dr. Jack Horner. Dr. Horner is a renowned paleontologist who has made important discoveries about dinosaurs and is currently an instructor at Chapman University. Jack is also dyslexic and here to share his story. And Dr. Hoeft is a professor of psychological science and neuroscience at University of Connecticut. She's also the director of the Laboratory for Learning, Engineering, and Neural Systems at UCSF, where she also has a leadership role with the Dyslexia Center. So without further ado, Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman.
Hi, I don't know if I was going to get any intro music. Can you see me and hear me? Can everyone see and hear me?
All good.
Great. Welcome to Critical Conversations about Cognitive Diversity. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman. I'm deeply interested in all things cognitive diversity. That includes everything on the every single spectrum. I care about it all, and how extraordinary strengths can combine. Our topic today is on dyslexia with these two esteemed guests, Fumiko and Jack, that Chris just introduced. Now, is it possible for Fumiko and Jack to start their videos? Because I don't think their videos are on, and I think our guests are very excited to see them. There they are, yay! Hey guys, it says not just me, that leaving me stranded. Thanks, guys. Really so great to have you two here today and discuss a topic that honestly, I don't know that much about, the science of dyslexia. I didn't grow up with dyslexia. I had many other things I grew up with, but that wasn't one of them. I thought we could start with Jack's early childhood experiences growing up with dyslexia, and maybe you can talk a little bit about how those early experiences kind of formed to who you are today.
Well, dyslexia is a funny thing, and I keep saying that. When I was, as all kids are, when we're young, you don't know what's wrong with you, but you're different. And I was even in kindergarten and first grade, even when I was really young, it was clear that I couldn't read. Even in kindergarten, when they had the teacher had blocks and had a bunch of it had all the letters on it. And what was funny was, the little letters, the B, the P, the Q, all those letters that look absolutely identical to one another, and it just depends on how you stand them up. You were just totally confused. It was baffling to me because it was one letter. I mean, it was just one thing. And then the teacher would say, she'd say, this is a D and this is a B. And I'm like, wow, that's the same thing. And then, if it fell over, then it was a P or a Q or something. It was just disgusting. It was awful, and when I was young, I was just totally baffled by stuff like that, and trying to learn those letters and how to say them and how to read them in a series. I just couldn't do it, and I went through first grade and second grade, and the teacher would always send this note home with my mother that says, they never said I was, doing terrible. They just kept saying he could really do a lot better. And, my father just thought I was lazy. And it was very difficult. I was sad. I cried when I was a little kid. I just really, it was just a horrible experience. But at the same time, school was awful, but at the same time, I would go out in my backyard in a vacant lot behind my house and find fossils. And I started a fossil collection when I was very young. I found my, first fossil when I was 4 years old, and I found my first dinosaur bone when I was 8. And so I was already and I found my first dinosaur skeleton when I was 13.
What? Like you discovered it in like your backyard or something?
Yes, very near my backyard. Yes, and so
it's incredible.
And so there was this. I was doing terrible in school, and I felt really bad, and I didn't know what to do about it. And I was pretty uncoordinated as a kid. I mean, it was just a lot of things wrong. But I think my self-confidence remained pretty high because I was collecting these cool fossils, and I would take them to school, and I could talk to the kids about what they were, my friends and stuff. I mean, and I eventually built a pretty nice collection, and it's still in our city library in Shelby, Montana. I mean, it's still there.
Incredible.
And then in high school, I was still doing really poorly, getting really bad grades. But I was, a war baby. And so all of the, our class was huge compared to everybody else. So they just kept passing everyone along because there was so many students. And so when I graduated from high school, I had the English teacher gave me a D minus. And he said, it means you flunked my English class, but we're not going to keep you here. We're just going to let you go. So with your D minus, you're not going to get anywhere in this world, but there you go. You passed, you graduated from high school. So. Yeah.
So how did you get into college?
Well, fortunately, my senior year, I made a science project on fossils that I had collected all those years, and it was a pretty good project, and it won the science fair, and in fact, I won the science fair all 4 years of high school. I won every science fair that I entered, and basically flunked every science class that I took in school. So people were, they just didn't understand it. I mean, nobody understood it. I didn't understand it. My mother didn't understand it. My father definitely didn't understand it. But, I had a whole year to make a science project. I had as much time as I wanted. And so, I made this incredible project on fossils my senior year, and it won a bunch of ribbons, and I got to go to the state fair, and the people that were judging the state fair were the geologists from the University of Montana, and they invited me to go to college there, even though I was about to get a D minus in English. And fortunately at that time, Montana, in Montana, you could actually go to college if you had a high school diploma. So I went, and of course my first year in school, in college, even taking, geology classes and paleontology classes, I failed them. In fact, I basically failed every single class I ever took except swimming. I got an A in swimming.
You got an A in something.
That's right.
Wow. Do you have a PhD? You ended up in
No, I do not. I have a high school diploma though.
So you said you never graduated college?
I never did. I have 2 honorary doctorates. One is from the University of Montana, after flunking out 7 times, 7 different quarters, and then getting a job at Princeton University and doing some research and publishing some papers. They gave me an honorary doctorate of science.
Aren't you a professor right now
I am.
at Chapman?
I am.
So one can be a professor without a college degree.
Well, you know, I did get a few other things. I got 2 honorary doctorates, and
Yeah, that's true.
they gave me a MacArthur Fellowship. That helped a lot.
See, that's the way to do it. Kids, don't go to college. Get an honorary doctorate. What that's amazing. And the MacArthur is it's literally your genius.
That's what they say. Yeah. Who knows?
Wow, what an incredible story. I'd like to bring Fumiko in here in a second. You do all this research at the generalizable level, right? Like looking at brain scans, looking at in the aggregate, the dyslexic mind and brain and characteristic of dyslexia. How do you fit Jack into the framework, the scientific framework of this latest science of dyslexia? Isn't he fascinating?
He is. I wish I could say everyone can be like that. It's a remarkable story, and I'm always fascinated. It's unfortunately, the research is really, really slow to catch up on this. And as you might see in the literature for the past many decades, people have been really fixated on what is the cause of dyslexia, and have neglected everything about other important things like the social emotional aspects or persistence, or how they feel threatened in schools or feel like they are not doing well, or that the talent and the creativity that sometimes comes with it, like in the case of Jack Horner. And so it's usually funded by the National Institute of Health, which is federal. So they really want to find the cause, the genetic cause, the neural cause. And people have been struggling. The researchers have been struggling for the past many decades. And I think they're starting to realize that we're all starting to realize that we really have to look at the whole child and the whole aspect of it. So now I see a lot of funding kind of coming in for the social emotional aspects, how to promote growth mindset in individuals. I know it's sometimes a controversial term these days among some researchers, but growth mindset has been learned to, we know now that it independently predicts reading outcome, and it's not just reading and language measures that predict success in reading, for example, and these social emotional aspects are very important. And so now finally the federal government is putting in money to do research on this. And so we have a federal grant looking at kind of these stereotype threat, for example, in the classroom, and how that might kind of decrease their performance. We're looking at compensatory mechanisms. So people who do remarkably well despite their diagnosis of dyslexia and struggling to read, and also trying to look at strength-based approaches. So if you have weaknesses and strengths, is it better to kind of focus on the strengths or focus on the weakness? The answer is probably both. You need to do both. But how does it look like if you focus on the strengths? So we're just starting that kind of research. And so I don't have the answers and there's more questions, but it's a good sign that the federal agencies and other foundations are very interested in this. And this is, for example, funded by the Oak Foundation, and one of it is funded by the National Institute of Health. So I think we'll have more answers to how Jack's brains look like in the near future, not quite yet. I know some people have looked at Einstein's brains. I was just kind of reading up on the latest on that one. And so there's hints of things everywhere, and I can talk more about the speculation from the evolutionary perspective of the brain, but it's still at the speculation level.
Did Einstein have dyslexia? Is that why you brought up Einstein?
Einstein is suspected to have had dyslexia based on some of the characteristics, and it's just kind of speculation. Of course, there wasn't a law that we had to diagnose individuals with dyslexia. That only started in the 70s. So we don't really know for sure. Some have speculated that, and so some have been interested in his brain from the perspective of talented visual, spatial, and math abilities, but also maybe they thought there might be some clues about language and learning issues related to reading there.
This is the first I've heard of that, but I'm not surprised because people attribute all sorts of quotes that he never said to Einstein. And I think they also attribute every learning disability to Einstein as well. Einstein's got it all. So this is very, very interesting. I did want to ask the colloquial, boring question, which is there agreed upon definition of what dyslexia is in the field? And then I want to get to more interesting questions. So let's just get that boring one out of the way. Is there like a technical definition?
I can give you the boring answer, but according to the National Institute of Health or the International Dyslexia Association, and all these authorities and organizations define it as a brain-based learning disabilities with specific problems in reading. So they have great cognitive abilities, strength in many areas, but they have particular problems in learning to read. And that's a definition. You can see from the word dyslexia, dys is problems or deficits, lexia is related to reading. And so that's the definition. So, which also kind of scientifically makes it a little bit harder to say all dyslexics have talents, even because you define it based on one aspect, which is a problem aspect, then the other strengths and other things are going to be very diverse, and there's going to be no one answer to it, so people are going to start looking very different from individual to individual.
Well, that's the exact segue into the crux of the matter that I wanted to get into. I think it's a little controversial in the field. And I saw that in the book I edited, the Twice Exceptional book, where I had you as a contributor, and then I had another researcher of dyslexia as a contributor, and your chapters couldn't have been any more different in terms of perspective. So it seems like there's one camp which says, well, if you have dyslexia, you're also gifted, because you have dyslexia. Mm-hmm. It comes with all these hidden strengths. Now, there's another perspective, which is like, hold up, let's think about this analytically. It's possible to have dyslexia, and it's also possible to be gifted. It's possible to have a juxtaposition of those two, but there's some where the two come together, and there's some humans where they just don't come together. Like, they're separate things. How in the world can we scientifically tease that apart and come to an answer on that? Because it could be that the people who are, if we think about it very analytically and logically, it's possible that there are those who are in the dyslexia means you're a genius camp. They're actually extrapolating from the subset of cases of people who actually just have a comorbidity of dyslexia and genius. Like Jack, it's not that maybe it's not that Jack's dyslexia that made him the genius. It's the fact he's a genius and he has dyslexia. So let's get to the crux of this matter. What does the evidence say about it, and how in the world can science tease that apart?
Right. And I think, so each individual is different. And if everyone were the same, and if we were all like Jack Horner, maybe he won't be that special anymore, right? So that's kind of one way to look at it. But I think there's no set answer to this. And I'll give you both kind of perspectives. So I think the camp that says it's if you are dyslexic, you have talents, and talents can be measured in many different ways. I think the original kind of thinking came from a neurologist, a very famous neurologist called Norm Geschwin, who passed away in the 80s. But this was presented as the evolutionary perspective of dyslexia. So one would say, if you have reading problems, and it seems like it starts from when you're developing the brain, and it starts at a very young age, the really early signs, then so if you think about kind of a problem in one part of the brain, there's a natural compensation or plasticity and reorganization of the brain that makes the area surrounding it or the opposite side of the hemisphere different. And so if it's low on one end, you might think about it as a seesaw. I call it the yin yang sometimes, but then the other parts might be more heightened, or the surrounding areas. And if you think about the locations of the surrounding area or the opposite side, people think that there might be some visual spatial abilities kind of in those parts of the brain, this temporoparietal area. So that's why some people said, aha, it makes sense, because I see a lot of architects, I see a lot of mathematicians and these kind of things, and you start connecting the dots and you think there's enough evidence. It's not scientifically proven, but it does make sense when you think about the evolutionary perspective of how the brain should be organized. And so that's kind of one camp that has not been proven. One small evidence that we have, we did several years ago, we did a neuroimaging study, we published this, and what we found was we looked at reading abilities and visual spatial abilities. The visual spatial abilities was the Penrose staircase, the impossible stairs, the Escher stairs. And so basically it was a 3D impossible figure or a possible figure, and they had to judge if that was possible or impossible. And those who were better at this and faster at getting those more accurate were those who tended to be poor readers. So there was this seesaw sort of effect that if you were a better reader, you were not as good in these judgments. And if you were a poor reader, you were better in those judgments. So it went like sort of like this. And the brain also went sort of like this as well in many areas. And so that was some kind of hint that maybe there is this kind of yin-yang relationship. Of course, we don't know if it's a cause, that they were born that way and the brain was organized and meant to be, or we don't know if that's because, I mean, I can look at my son as well. He doesn't like to read, or he didn't like to read. And so he would be escaping and running away and playing the Lego all the time, every minute we had. And we said, oh, since he's happy, he likes doing it, it's not a bad thing, let's just have him play Legos. So there's him that likes to gravitate toward things he likes. So he gets naturally better at those things. And then also then he changes the environment, the parent's perspective, and say, let's let him do it since he loves it and he looks happy. And so there's this kind of gene environment interaction possibly as well, that if you fail at one thing, then you tend to escape and do other things. And you get better at it because you do a lot of it. And a lot of people say that I don't have talent, but I'm an expert in this because I spent so much time on it and I love doing this. Right? So that's one kind of idea. The other idea is there's a business school professor in England called, what's her name? Julie Logan, I think. And what she came up with, she had 2 survey studies. And what she found was that she did a survey to individuals and found that over a third of entrepreneurs had dyslexia traits. And this was survey measure, so it's not as quantitative or methodological in a way, but it was interesting because if you looked at more executives of companies, it was much lower. I think it was about 5 to 10% of the individuals were found to be dyslexia or have that kind of traits in executives versus entrepreneurs, a third. So a very different composition. And people could say which one's chicken or egg, but it was interesting that she replicated it again. And the way she framed it was, it's not maybe innate, but it could be because they fail so many times, and those who tend to be more resilient and come out, so sprouting from the desert, a plant blooming, a flower blooming in the desert, and it's sort of that trait. So if you survive, then what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, like the Nietzsche sort of idea. And so it could be because of that, they become talented. And so there's many different pieces that could potentially play a role in that. And it could be true, but more research needs to be done. Sorry, it was long, but.
It was wonderful. It was just what we want here. By the way, I would like to encourage all the people on this call to type things in the chat box. I want to know that you're alive. So just at least just one person can you just thank you. That's all. Just like we want to know that you're engaged, that you're finding this interesting, that you're here, that we're not just in an echo chamber. So that's wonderful. Fumiko, that's really great. And I'm fascinated with this linkage to, well, at least we know we got one person engaged, Sheila. Thank you, Sheila. This link to creativity is fascinating to me because yes, it's true that creativity involves large-scale brain networks. This old left brain versus right brain dichotomy has broken down. However, there is some interesting research using TDSC, showing that if you inhibit, transcranial direct stimulation, if you turn down the current on the language centers, people are better at insight problems. And that's so interesting. And I wonder, has anyone ever looked at the linkage there with dyslexia? Like, could it be, I sound like Ancient Aliens, the TV show National Geographic, could it be aliens? No, could it be that that the unique brain configuration of people with dyslexia, that language, some people have argued that language is oppressive, to our creativity, and our ability to make insights. It gets in the way, Could it be that people like Jack are more creative and insightful because of his unique brain configuration linked to dyslexia?
I think according to this, the evolutionary theory of dyslexia, I think it's very, very possible, like something similar to what I said with Norm Geschwin's idea many decades ago. It has not been proven, but I think it's interesting. But for example, when you look at dementia patients, and Bruce Miller from UCSF and others have done kind of interesting work where if they have some focal kind of dementia and atrophy in the brain, that it kind of unleashes creativity. And there's several papers on this topic. So it does kind of, in the aging population, there has been some work and cases on these that's been done in California and other places, but it is very exciting to think about this, and it really makes me think that we should be doing this. I know Dyslexia Center at UCSF is doing some where they're bringing in talented people and scanning their brain. Jack, if you're interested, we definitely would love to see your brain if you haven't been invited yet.
Pull it out, Jack.
Maybe Scott also, you might qualify if you show if you show some dyslexia-like traits. But so there are people who are interested. Unfortunately, it's not the area where NIH and other kind of major funders support. We'd love to appreciate any foundations who might be interested in these topics, and we'd love to do more research on this. But we have done some work on stealth dyslexia, for example. I know that comes up quite often, and others. But I'd love to hear what Jack thinks about whether he thinks it was because he felt that other people, where you didn't feel that you were doing well and you felt like you struggled and failed, and kind of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. You believe in that aspect, or you feel like there was something that I felt different, and kind of I could come up with solutions in different ways that other people didn't. I mean, looking at your research, it makes me think that your creativity has to be there innately, but I might know.
Well, one of the things that I tell my students, and I don't want it to sound, it could come out sounding wrong, like I'm aloof or something, but I oftentimes tell my students that if you do it first, you don't have to read anything, right? So really, if you're working on, if you can find a project that nobody really has thought about, and an interesting question, that you really do not have to read a bunch of stuff, and us just, reading is the hardest thing I do in my life, and to be a research scientist, where you're supposed to read a bunch of stuff, I have found that, if I have a project that nobody's ever done before, that's a lot less reading. So
I have a funny story about that one, but go ahead, please finish.
Well, I mean, so dinosaur eggs, dinosaur eggs, people had found dinosaur eggs for 100 years, and yet no one had ever found a dinosaur embryo, and come to find out, people thought they were precious. They thought the egg was precious, and so nobody had ever opened one up. And so I got to be the first person to find a dinosaur embryo just because I had a hammer, and I wasn't afraid to break it open, and I did. I mean, I just broke it open, and I broke a few of them open, and before I found my first embryo. But glue is cheap. You just glue it back together if it's not in there. So, but people just hadn't realized that they actually could do that.
Wait, are there dinosaur embryos that can still grow to?
No.
Wouldn't that be
only in Jurassic Park?
I was going to say, wouldn't that be amazing if we discovered that there was an embryo that was preserved in ice and could
make another movie.
Yeah. Well, I tend to blur reality and fantasy, so I was getting excited that this might actually be a possibility. You were advisor on Jurassic World, right?
All the Jurassic Park movies. All
of them for the 93 one?
Yep.
So I'm obsessed with those movies. I read some misconceptions about them. One is that Jurassic Park raptors didn't hunt in packs. Isn't that true? Like that was
Actually,
understood.
we actually have pretty good evidence that they did.
Really?
But there's a good scientific argument going on right now about that.
Yeah.
There are people who don't think that they did, and
yeah,
people like myself who think we have plenty of evidence that says we do, that they did.
So it's actually possible they did. If there was one dinosaur that out of all of them that you would love to have as a pet, which one would it be?
Well, you know, my favorite dinosaur is Maiasaura. That's the first one I named. The problem with it is, you know, it hatches out of its egg about 16 inches long and grows to 9 feet long the first year. And then, you know, it's 35 feet when it's full grown. So they're hard to keep it. They'd be hard to keep as a pet. And a velociraptor is really small and, you know, it'd make a nice pet, except it would eat your cat, your dog, and all the neighbors. So
that might not be a downside. You might not like your neighbors.
You know, birds are dinosaurs, and we have my wife and I have a parrot. So you know that's a dinosaur unto itself. So that's probably the best you can. They're small, and they don't eat cats.
Fair enough. Now you turn the argument on its head though, because you've argued that just reading is overrated in general. Like, you know,
absolutely.
And we asked you, you know, some questions like dyslexia, like how, you know, a lot of people, what are the educational interventions to help people with dyslexia? You're like, I want to teach people to be dyslexic. So you have turned the whole question on its head. You are the definition of creativity, which I love. I think you're so cool.
I think it's interesting. I think it's good that, you know, kids learn how to read the best they can in grade school or wherever it is. But then as you get older, you know, I think thinking is just more important. You know, I mean, less reading, more thinking.
Right. And I would add, and I agree. My research on imagination, less imagination. So not just thinking, but
right. Use your imagination.
The default mode network. What is the relationship between the default mode network and dyslexia, Fumiko? Have you looked into that?
We have not looked into it. I don't think there's any reports on it. Unfortunately, I think there's some interest, and we talked about it. It's easy to look at, but we have not looked at, which makes me think that I should take notes and go back and look at it.
Yeah.
Did you want to explain what the default mode network is to other people and the significance of it?
Reconceives network. It incorporates 3 major subsystems that work together as a team. That's why it's called a network, with mental simulation and spontaneous internal generation of cognition, or I just call it the imagination network. It's a fancy way of, you know, it involves perspective taking, it involves mental simulation of yourself in the future. But I don't think it's necessarily very language heavy, because the precuneus is a big part of it, and that's visual spatial, right? It's definitely not language oriented. So I would love to know what Jack's precuneus looks like. I bet it's up the kazoo in terms of activation.
Okay.
Yeah. So love the default mode network. So Jack, I really like this perspective you have. So what would that mean in terms of shifting the whole education system? Because see, this is interesting. A lot of people ask the opposite question. They say, well, how can we take a square peg and put it into a round hole? I'm bad with my metaphors, but how can we take something that doesn't fit and how do we force it to fit into an education system? I'm feeling your vibe is more, well, I think we need to change the education system to, correct me if I'm wrong, but to accommodate the brilliance of, why not accept the way the person is already, you know, and help them self-actualize. I mean, that's my jive. That's my vibe too. Do you want to elaborate at all on if I gave you $5 billion to change the education system, what you would do?
You know, the education system needs changing anyway, because, you know, we've got basically all of the information we need is on our phone now. And so, you know, go to a school and they're just giving you the same information that you get off your phone. I mean, and in fact, the information on your phone is more up to date than the information that your teacher can give you. And so, there's no reason for schools to just be giving information now. They need to be teaching you how to use that information and how to find that, how to get a hold of that information. That's really what we should be learning. But also, rather than, I encourage my students, rather than read a book about somebody's adventure, write your own adventure. I just think it's, there's lots of really good books out there. People do write books. They should be read by somebody, especially the people that like to read. But the rest of us that don't like to read, we should be out there writing more.
Or call a friend.
Yes, agreed. I don't know if you can hear my Alexa talk.
Oh, okay.
Tells me to take a walk.
What did she say?
It's 1:38 p.m. and I have her programmed to tell me, Scott, it's time to take a walk, go for a stretch, or call a friend. That's what she said. I had no way of turning that off. But yeah, you were on a roll. That was beautiful. And I'm very curious to hear perspectives from parents in the room. I think now's a good time to open this up, if it's okay with you two, if we can really open up to the questions from people who joined us today. I'm curious, are there any parents on the call today where your child has dyslexia, is maybe struggling in terms of how to fit in a school system that's so reading heavy? Tova Cooper says yes. Do you all have any specific questions? Okay, here's the question. Can you speak to problems of cognitively diverse adults in an organizational setting? Have either of you two thought about dyslexia in organizational setting, both in terms of helping the individual behavior seen as negative and helping other members' negative reactions? So dyslexic adults.
Yeah, I think some of the things that people in some organizations are doing is self-advocacy, I think, and how to train individuals with dyslexia so they can self-advocate for themselves, to kind of make other people understand their strengths as well as kind of difficulties, so people can support each other. Everyone has strengths and everyone has weaknesses. Some people are very sloppy but has creativity, and some people might be very detail oriented but can't come up with new ideas. And I think it's the same sort of idea, and some people call it neurodiversity. Some people don't like using that term, such as researchers, but so there's one aspect of that. I think the other aspect, and we're doing research into this, is the concept of stereotype threat that we talked about, that we have to realize that if you are surrounded by people who have this negative stereotype about someone or a group of individuals, those individuals might underperform. So educating the people around them is very, very important, which if it's in a professional setting, it could be the HR's job or whatever it might be, or a diversity officer and these kind of things. And I think with the Black Lives Matter and other kind of movements, I think it's very, very becoming active to kind of accept everyone and kind of very being mindful of each individual's unique characteristics. But I think it comes in on both sides. I'm sorry?
Dyslexic lives matter. We need another hashtag. Yeah, or neurodiverse minds, divergent minds matter as well. So you hinted on stealth dyslexia earlier, and you left people on the edge of their seat. Can you tell us what that term even means and what your research showed?
So I'll try to be brief because I could talk about each one of these topics for hours, but stealth dyslexia was first coined in 2005 by Brock and Fernette Ides, and they're up in Washington. I think they're still up there. And they wrote a nice book on sort of giftedness, or the four R's and kind of strengths that they might have. And it was pretty popular at the time, so several years ago or a decade ago or so. And then there was a New Yorker article where I was interviewed where I talked about stealth dyslexia. In the research community, we call it, I'll get to the definition, but in the research community, we sometimes call it resilient dyslexics, which I use in the research setting, or compensated dyslexics. But basically what it is that you have the characteristic dyslexia characteristics, which is difficulty specifically in reading, but also So if you think about the mechanics of reading, you have the decoding piece that you need to read and decode the words to be able to comprehend. And the ultimate importance of reading is understanding, comprehension, right? So even if you can decode, if you can't comprehend, those are sometimes called hyperlexics. And you see often or sometimes in autism, that's a problem because the ultimate goal of reading is to comprehend, but it's the opposite. So you have problems in reading, but you're really good at reading comprehension. So that's basically the idea behind stealth dyslexia or resilient dyslexics. And we've done some research into this. Some people think it was speculated, and the ID speculated that they might be good problem solvers. They might have dyslexia and have problems reading, but they might use a lot of these kind of frontal part of the brain and problem solving skills, and it might be enhanced in those individuals. That leads them to kind of reading comprehension, kind of superiority in a way. And so we looked at kind of the brain mechanisms underlying this. And what we found was it was very unique. The more differences they had or dissociation, so the more stealth they were or resilient they were, we found stronger or bigger, in our case, prefrontal cortex. And it was the part of the brain that's really important. We found out that it was important, that was connected to other parts of the brain like the frontal parietal, and it's important for memory and cognitive control. And some people attribute that area to problem solving. Some people call it the executive director of the brain. So it's like the master orchestrator of the brain, this network. And what we found was that part seemed to be stronger or bigger in individuals who were more stealth dyslexic.
Just to clarify, that was in the dorsal region, because the default mode network is also technically part of the prefrontal cortex, but it's
more of the dorsal part, the outside part, in the frontal, just around here.
The dorsal part.
We published this a couple years ago.
It's interesting because on average, dyslexia, a common theme is executive dysfunction among those with dyslexia. So that's interesting. That's a unique brain configuration that you've discovered there. I'm a parent of a profoundly gifted dyslexic and dysgraphia child. What ways can we impact our educational system to benefit the neurodiversity we need in our society? I mean, that's a very lofty question, obviously. Do you have any thoughts on
spatial ed?
What did you say?
Spatial ed.
Well, that's interesting. Instead of special ed, spatial ed.
Exactly.
See, you want to turn the whole thing on its head and make the neurotypical the neurodiverse.
Exactly. Precisely.
I just love it. I love it. So a lot of people really like the spatial ed concept. Although someone spelled the word spatial wrong, I think. No, did they? Maybe they didn't. No, maybe I did. Yeah.
I think it is not spelled correctly. I think you need a T there.
Right? Am I right? Yeah, I'm not going. I'm not going crazy, right? Like
we might be all dyslexia wannabes here, but yes, potentially.
People really, no, isn't spatial with a T? Am I going crazy? Why is everyone doing it with a C? Yes, I think it's with a T. I'm pretty sure it's with a T.
I love the audience here.
Oh my gosh.
But I think there's some other questions. I don't know if you want to cover, if you're trying to cover everything. I know there's something on distance learning, something on others.
Distance learning kept coming up over and over again by this, and I asked her if she would please, Tova, can you please elaborate on what your question about distance learning was? Because you said my son is 8 and creates epic poetry off the top of his head, but only verbally. He has a very tough time reading and writing. Please address the distance learning question. But I scrolled up and I couldn't find the distance learning question.
I think it was very much toward the beginning.
It is Arlene's question above. How can we help our dyslexic children who are struggling with distance learning? Okay, there we go. How can we help so let's address this, because we're in this age of COVID. So much of it is virtual and online. Do you two see opportunities for dyslexics to, maybe it's even good, it's like good for them, that in this sort of situation, or is it harder for them? What are you seeing during this time, COVID and dyslexic individual students?
So we have a National Science funded project, and it answers, I think, one of the other questions that someone had on what can they do for a dyslexic child during this period of time. So just FYI, I'm not going to go into details because I don't want to waste time on promotional sort of content, but we have a National Science Foundation funded project. If you look if you contact me or Haskins, I think you can put it on the website later because I saw a resources page on your Bridges Academy website, but and I can post the link there. But we have a project called Project Rescue, and it's for entering kindergartners to second graders. If you're interested, we have a computer adaptive reading program, and we have free progress monitoring that's going on that they can start. It's a gamified sort of program. Hopefully it's fun, and they can do it at home to progress in reading during this time. I know it's really hard for some people who are receiving learning specialist attention and IP kind of accommodations during this time, during COVID. So I think that's one thing. I know there's a number of different resources. I'm happy to post those for those individuals with dyslexia, and that might be helpful and that I found helpful that I share with other families as well. So that's one piece. I think I've heard that social emotionally, it's actually beneficial. So the bright spot is that I've heard some positive stories that distance learning has been good for the child because they don't have to experience the stereotype threat that they're going to be pointed at any time, and there's less reading out loud and those kind of things right now. So I've heard some positive stories about this. I think the majority, though, is struggling because they're not receiving the small individualized attention, especially if you go to public schools, because it's not fair to do small group instructions when you have to address the needs for everyone, for example. So it gets really harder. I think when you look at join some of these webinars for distance learning, and everyone's doing this, great organizations are hosting this. Everyone talks about small group recommendations for teachers, hold small group instructions, use breakout rooms in Zoom and other things. But it's really hard. It really does come down to parents' availability of time and interest and how they can be proactive. But I will post some websites that I found interesting related to COVID, including the statistics and how children who are in special ed or under-resourced areas might be severely impacted, and the concerns around it as well.
Thank you. This is fantastic. I'm actually curious the difference. A lot of other people are curious about this as well. The difference between dyslexia and dysgraphia.
So just briefly, I know we don't have too much time to go into any details for any of them, but dyslexia is reading problems. Dysgraphia, graph is the act of writing. The problem with dyslexia or dysgraphia is that with dysgraphia, you have many different kinds. If you have spelling problems, so most basic one is writing problems. If you can't write, and if you have fine motor issues, you might have dysgraphia. If you have spelling issues, even though you can easily imagine that it's completely different brain mechanisms underlying it, you still have dyslexia. If you have written expression problems, you still might be diagnosed with dysgraphia. And those are very different things. Reading difficulties or reading disorders, same thing also. If you can't decode, and if you can't read and comprehend the content, it could be all lumped into reading problems and put in the same sort of special support. And then you can't really individualize this, but they are highly related. They're highly comorbid. I think the statistics probably is around 40 to 6% in terms of the literature. And it's a lot more than coincidence, but there's so much comorbidity or co-occurrence with math problems, there's different theories behind this, writing problems, attention problems, ADHD, they're all much higher than the general statistics, and usually the numbers around 40% comorbidity. And it's really hard to tease apart, and the science is not quite there yet.
And then what's dyscalculia?
Math problems.
Is there a comorbidity there at all with dyslexia?
Some people say that it's up to 60% or up to 50%. The precise number is not known. But of course, math disabilities is also very, very diverse. Maybe it's rote memory type 2 + 3 is 5. They might struggle with those. And some people think that's more related to dyslexia because of the phonological sort of aspect. And then it could be math reasoning, which is more related to comprehension. And it could be calculation, which is kind of more different and might be more related to visual spatial, for example. So for each of these, I think they're dissecting these based on the educational system, and it's not doing it based on the brain system. So if we can be more brain-based organized in terms of the education system and align it, I think we could potentially have great solutions in the future. But that's my personal opinion.
More Legos.
More Legos, I love it.
Kids need more Legos. Yeah, everybody should. That's what we should just make sure all the kids have Legos.
Do you have it in your car right now? A box of Legos? I thought you carried it around all the time.
I've got one of the biggest Lego collections in the world, I think.
Wow, we might have to compete and compare notes sometime.
Incredible. By the way, I got almost blacklisted from the world headquarters of Lego because I said Legos, and technically it turns out that the plural of Lego is Lego bricks, but there's no such thing as Legos.
Oh.
I've been saying it my whole life as well, and I was in world headquarters, and they're like, oh, no, he didn't. Just say Legos. So, and anyway, I thought I would, little Lego trivia.
I think just finish off this question. Can I just answer this dysgraphia and why dysgraphia and written expressions combined? I think, again, it's back to the educational system, and I'm not here to criticize. I think it's a good system that's there for a reason. I think it could be changed, but it's also kind of hard without evidence and moving forward. But it's because writing classes are all lumped together. So anything that's related to writing gets lumped into dysgraphia. Reading classes are all lumped together. So anything that's related to reading, even though the brain mechanism, if you think about it, is completely different probably for these systems, and they get lumped together. And so same for math. So I think instead of going for writing, reading, math, I sometimes talk about we should dissect it completely differently and orthogonally and go by brain systems of kind of phonological mapping, memory system, kind of this expression and creativity, and these kind of more high level cognition. And they could be different classes in different ways. I'd love to, Scott, maybe you should build a school with Jack that goes that way in a completely different way.
Brilliant. And there's no such thing as special ed. There's spatial ed, there's music ed, it's just different eds. No special ed. So I believe we only have 5 minutes left. Chris, is that right? Is that roughly correct? We only have 5 minutes left.
Yes, that's correct.
If that's the case, I want to just make sure I ask this because it has become so apparent to me the importance for more science on this topic and less I don't know the word for it, but you see in educational circles conjecture. There's a lot. That's the word I'm looking for. You see a lot of educators think they know the answer. They'll say, "Well, here's my dyslexia program," and it's not science backed at all. Do you see that in when you step into the educational circles? Are there any misconceptions that you see things being promulgated within the dyslexia community that you don't think is on a strong scientific foundation yet?
I think it might be more related to, I'm kind of thinking about the question, the answers. I know I can come up with many of them, but just in this brief, I'm not very good with pressure and time pressure here, but possibly related to education system more broadly. Learning profiles often comes up.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of, it's an unproven, I think I don't like either side. So people who go gung-ho about learning profiles and saying we have to teach to their learning styles, I think that's a misconception because there's no science behind it. But then there's also these researchers who are saying there's no such thing as learning styles. It's all bad, it's all fake, and so on. And I think that's an extreme as well because our brains are all different. There are preferences to our learning styles or whatever you want to call it. I like doing things through hearing, for example, and some people would love to read things, and I love making graphs for everything. And people say, I don't understand graphs, and you have to write out that paragraph and explain it to me. And so there's people have preferences. Whether that matches with their brain organization is a different question. And we're starting to answer some of these with our Oak Foundation and NIH funded projects, but it's going to take a while for it to kind of, and I'm sure with everything else, it's somewhere in between, and it's this balancing act. And strength-based approaches is another one that's interesting. Left brain, right brain kind of issues always come up. I think there's always two extremes. I always tend to be kind of I think there's something to be said about both sides.
Wonderful. And Jack, you wrote an autobiography, is that correct?
Well, I guess you could call it that. Mm-hmm.
What's the book called?
No, it's not a book. It's a. I'm writing one. I am writing one, a book, autobiography. Now, I wrote I don't know, it was just like a chapter.
Could you share that chapter or tell people how they can purchase it?
You can't purchase it. It's on. I don't even know. It's on a thing called the Montana Professor through the University of Montana.
Because people want to read this. So
but the book is coming along.
Okay.
I'd say half. It's definitely half finished. Probably a little more. I don't know. How do you finish an autobiography other than, kicking the bucket?
Well, you have a lot of people who want to see the movie version of your life as well as the book. So we have to get you connected to someone in Hollywood. Maybe the Jurassic Park folks could make a movie of your life and have dinosaurs in it.
Yeah.
I am remiss that I didn't have more time today to nerd out with you about dinosaurs. But I've been controlling myself very much because I wanted to respect, the scientific discussion. But I want to talk about raptors, I want to talk about the T-Rex and all the ways the T-Rex has been depicted and what's the real T-Rex look like. But I have lots of questions. But I just really want to thank both of you so much for gracing us with your presence today and helping everyone learn more about the dyslexic mind.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you, Chris and Stephanie, for making this happen behind the scenes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to all of those who have joined us today. Keep your eye on TUInews.com for information about our September webcast, which will feature Dr. C. Matthew Fugate, who's an assistant professor at University of Houston, whose research is in the relationship between working memory and levels of creativity in gifted students who have characteristics of ADHD. He's also examined the coping mechanisms of twice exceptional girls in secondary school as they navigate both their academic studies and their interpersonal relationships. So thank you everybody so much again, and have a good evening.
Bye. Stay away from the T-Rexes.